Yeah, so welcome back. Welcome to week 6. What we're going to do today is build on what we did last week. So this is simulations 2. The main focus of today's lesson is to get a simulation into a game engine, basically, or at least get you most of the way towards doing that. I'm going to show you the Bifrost stuff that'll enable you to get a simulation into a game engine. Now, just a quick run through for those of you that missed last week. We talked about particles, we talked about aero, and we talked about combustion. These are 3 of the main simulation setups in Bifrost, and what's really good about them is if I explode this guy, just move him there, let's put a backdrop on him, call that particles so we don't forget what we're doing, and then we'll take this one, we'll do the same thing, explode, bring it down here, add a backdrop, call it aero because it's aero. And then take our combustion, do the same thing. And once more, put a backdrop around here. If I zoom out, what you should be noticing straight away is that these look remarkably similar, and that's because they are. In the particles graph, you have a source, a collider, an influence, solver settings, and a simulation engine. You have the same thing in aero, source, collider, influence, solver settings, simulation engine. And you have the same in combustion, source, collider, influence, solver settings, and simulation engine. You also have 2 new sets of properties in the combustion which control things like the fuel properties and the combustion settings. This is quite deliberate. The fact that once you learn to simulate one thing, you have a big head start in simulating the rest. Today, we're going to make an explosion. And for an explosion, we need combustion. So let's get rid of these 2. We don't need them. And like all good computer graphic artists everywhere in the world, now it's time to save. And there we are. We have now backed ourselves up. We have something that we can go back to. All right. So we want to make an explosion, and we want to get that explosion into a game engine because games like explosions. There tends to be a lot of explosions in games. And this is a good thing to be working on. And as we go, I'm going to give you a really quick recap of what we did last week for those of you that weren't here. First thing I need to explain about combustion before I talk about anything else at all is how combustion works in the real world. If you want to make an explosion or a fire or anything in the real world, you need 3 things. You need fuel, you need heat, and you need oxygen. Those 3 things make fire. If you change the ratios of them or change the pressures of them, they can make an explosion. Or they can just make smoke. Depends what you want to do. We want to make an explosion. And we happen to have fuel and we happen to have heat. And we also happen to have oxygen right here. So let's go ahead and make this. First thing I'm going to need, before I do anything else, I'll need 2 things. But the first thing I'm going to need is a source. Something to emit my volume from. Now, here's something I prepared earlier. This is our old friend, the isosphere. So I'm going to drag that in there. There it is. And I'm just going to plug that in. So we now have a source. Move that out here. We also need to see what we're doing. So let's get the volume out into an assigned material. Because remember, if we want to see what's going on with the combustion and with the smoke and with all of that, we need a material to show us that in the viewport. And it's an Arnold material. And you can get to it easily by just right-clicking on the volume material, create node, Arnold standard volume material. This comes in set up for Bifrost. This is the Bifrost default. You can see it's got the fog density here. And it's got the voxel temperature here, and emission and temperature. So that's a nice, easy and handy way. And then all we need now is an output or a terminal. I'm just going to use an output because we're not going to be doing too much with it for a while. Plug that in there. And let's reset our solver and just see what we've got. We have a nice sphere of expanding something. Starts hot, it cools down, it goes upwards. It's pretty much what I expected, really. If you wanted to see what the density is doing, you can just come in here and just drop the density, but the density here is pretty even all the way through, which means we need to do some stuff to it. So let's think about explosions for a second. Before I do anything to the actual solver system, what I want to do is I want to vary some of the properties coming into the system. And I could do what we did last week and set up a fractal noise field and plug it into my temperature, run it through an F-curve field and all that kind of thing. That's all cool. That would work beautifully. But what I'm going to do instead is use vary source property. And vary source property is a super handy node when you're simulating, which allows you to replace, multiply, or add a property that's going into your simulation. If you want to know what properties you can use, you come over to the info node, and we are using source air. There you go, source air 1. So we need these ones. The very first one I want to get is temperature. So let's get the source property, and we'll say vary temperature. That's great. We're replacing whatever the solver is going to do. We're multiplying by 1, and we want a random variation for this because what we don't want is our temperature to just be the same thing everywhere. So this is why we've got vary source property, and we're going to animate that according to the frames. Now, you know, for what we're trying to achieve here, which is kind of a munitions explosion or something blowing up and then not burning, just an explosion that then lifts and turns into smoke and has a small mushroom cloud and does all that kind of stuff, you know, that sort of thing. So what we should do for that is like some of the fuel here, this is what this property is varying. It's varying the attributes on the actual solver itself. In this case, it's varying the temperature of the voxels. And the voxels, once they get hot enough, will ignite the fuel that we have coming in here. And our fuel ignition, oh, sorry, we have it coming in here. Our fuel ignition temperature is 580, which is all good. But I might want some fuel unburnt floating around. It can catch on fire later. It'll give us nice little sort of variation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually randomize our temperature from 0 to around 720. Now I can play that and you can see straight away what's happened. Let's go frame by frame. You see that the very hottest parts of the simulation have caught and ignited. It's quite a low res simulation, which is why you're seeing squares and things at the moment. And also I think our input is quite small. So let's save that. Just jump across to the attribute editor for the platonic shape, and we'll just change the radius to 10. Go back. Because we're procedural, we can do this sort of thing, and then you get a bigger one. And that's pretty cool. It's igniting and expanding outward quickly, and we are at quite low resolution. And then it's basically turning into smoke and lifting. That's a pretty good start. You can see the varying temperatures, it's changing the shape of the simulation because of the temperatures are varying and the buoyancy affects things differently. And there's still some unburnt fuel in there, which is pretty good. So that's our first one. So let's just call this VSP temp so we understand what we're doing. Now let's do another one. Vary source property. In this case, what I want to do is change the initial direction. Which way are they going out? Which way are they flying out? So we'll plug this in here. We can just daisy chain these together quite happily. Like this. I'm going to call this VSP direction. And immediately we run into a small hiccup in that a direction is a vector. It's not a float, and these are floats. Easy to change. If you come into random variation, right click, value type, math float 3. And all we need to do here is set up our minimum and our maximum directions. And of course, we better put in what property. You see we had temperature up here. So let's double check that. Again, source air. We want initial speed direction. And in our case, what I'd like this to do is fly out in all directions at the beginning, except down, because I want to have something blow up on the ground. And I don't want to have to do bounces, basically. I'm cheating. So I can change that here by saying, look, your minimum direction should be -1, 0, -1. And your maximum direction should be 1, 2, 1. So what's going to happen here is that everything's going to fly out in the X and Z at roughly equal directions and an equal spread. But there's going to be more things going up and nothing going down. So let's take a look at that and see what's happening. Not much at the moment. It doesn't look too different because we haven't changed the speed and we haven't changed how this data is interpolated, which we're going to get into. What we need now is speed. And speed is a float, so we can just leave things as they are. What we're basically doing is breaking up the initial vectors here into direction and speed. So VSP speed. And what we can do here is copy just initial speed because it's in the help. Right there, initial speed. So we'll grab that, pop on over to here, paste that down. And I want none of them to be at 0 speed. So let's say minimum speed of 2, maximum speed of 16. So, 16 is fairly quick for this scale. Let's have a look. Still not doing terribly much. There's a reason for that too. If we just stop that simulation, go back to the beginning. What we need to do here is change the way that the speed is set and the temperature is set. So I'm going to set my temperature to max. So it's going to use the maximum temperature in here. And I'm going to set my speed mode to set. So it's not evolving over a rate, it's being set at the very beginning. So what kind of a difference that makes. That was quite different. You can see, if I go back to the beginning, everything goes outwards and then starts to go up, which is what my buoyancy is doing, which is quite nice. And you've still got nice and hot stuff down here. And you're getting quite a lot of smoke being generated as well, which is pretty good. It's kind of what I want. So that's kind of what I'm going to do to the source attributes to just vary things up a bit. One thing I think I might do too is I might just animate the seed of direction and temperature so we get a quicker change. So let's throw in the time node. We're going to take the frame and we're going to multiply that by, let's say, where'd that go? Let's multiply this by 0.2 so we're not just screaming off into the wilds. And I'm going to need a couple of longs because I need to convert this data over to a long integer for the seed. For the temperature, I'm just going to use the frame. I'm going to vary the temperature much, much faster than I'm going to vary the direction. And this is just to try and get a look. We'll take a slower time mode here and change it there. So let's see sort of a difference that makes. I might just up my minimum speed a little bit and see if that helps any. That's looking pretty good. That's kind of what I'm liking here. And then things start to come up, which is cool. And before you ask, yeah, I'm working on information and data that I've prepared earlier, which is absolutely fine. So that's our source properties taken care of. I think I might just change this around a bit just to get an idea here. So if we put that one into there, and this guy, let's not put him into direction. Let's put him into speed. See what happens. So we put the seed there. Let's play that back. Doesn't look too different just yet, but we're working on that. There's our buoyancy. So I don't want this to happen all the time. Right now, what we're constantly adding fuel to this because it starts on frame 1 and it doesn't end. It's just constantly adding methane at varying temperatures and stuff. So I think that what needs to happen here is it's an explosion. It's an event. It happens and then it stops happening, if you know what I mean. So I'm going to set an end frame on the fuel to start with. I'm going to say, like, after 8 frames, don't emit any more fuel. Let's play that back. So by now, it's only got the fuel that it emitted. Everything's turning into smoke and floating upwards. You got a nice mushroom shape. It's not quite what I want, but it is. You've still got some heat in there. You can see when you scrub. Kind of see a little fuzzy bit down there as well. But what's happening is that everything's exploding and then lifting up. Just going upwards with its buoyancy. So it's now not emitting any more fuel. And I'm going to do the same thing with the source air. So this one's actually limiting the entire simulation. Take a look at what happens when I end that on frame 10. Yeah, so now we've just got a fireball. See, it's no longer emitting, and you've got these nice streaks coming up. Perfect. That's looking pretty good. That's looking pretty good indeed. Let's just change these. We can use fluid detail size so everything obeys this. So we're just changing our resolution to be a little bit higher, but still in relative mode for now, just so we can maybe see a little bit more. That's great. What this really needs, though, is to be sort of less flat and homogeneous. We need to put some turbulence in here, I think, to really make it stand out and look right. So what I'm going to use is a Rebel Pack node, Aero Einstein influence. Yeah, we're back to influences straight away. What the Aero Einstein influence will do for us is it's going to provide some turbulence and some vorticity all in one happy little package. So let's plug both of those into our influences, which is here. That one in there, and that one in there. And we'll get some settings going on. So I think, well, we can also look at the help, right? So fine turbulence is the strength of the fine turbulence. There are two turbulences here, a fine turbulence with a high frequency and a coarse turbulence with a low frequency. So I'm going to change the strength of the fine turbulence and the coarse turbulence as well, I think. Maybe I'll leave the coarse turbulence where it is, but I'll change that to 1.25. So the fine turbulence is just a little bit stronger. I'll leave the speed where it is for both of them and the frequency scale. And I'm just going to leave the vorticity at default. So let's play this and see what we get. You can see we're starting to get a bit more of a turbulent look in here, which is great. Stop that for now. Let's come down to the combustion settings. Make sure it's enabled, which it is. I'm going to enable a bit more soot, so there's more sort of smoke gets built as we go. That's something that I would like. I'm not going to oxidize the soot right now, which is fine. So let's take this back to the beginning, save it, and I'm going to now set my resolution to absolute. I'm going to leave the geo detail size at 0.04, and I'm going to give this a wee playthrough. So here we go. This is the absolute resolution. I've done a couple of things like scaled down my platonic solid. So what of course will happen is this will get slower as the explosion gets bigger, but to take a look at it, this is a very good thing. Our detail size is set at 0.04, and we're on absolute. So what I might do here is just change this turbulence a little bit, or the vorticity anyway. We can check this here. Strength of the vorticity at which you get maximum vorticity, and that's a velocity threshold. So let's just take that down and let's push this up and see what we get. And I'm pretty happy with that for now. That's looking pretty explodey. So to keep things working quickly, so I know what this looks like in high resolution now. To keep things fast, I'm going to take it back to relative, so that we can we've got the idea of the shape when we work with relative, and but it's a lot faster to work with, as you can see. We'll just let that do its thing. So now what we want to do is this stays very, very solid. Very, very solid. It's very hard edged. It looks, it's looking a little bit like a brain. Some kind of weird brain anyway. But really we want this to start dissipating, and we kind of want it to start dissipating only after a certain amount of time, which is fine, which is great. And that's because that's just a little bit of logic. Now we know how to dissipate. We've done it before. We did it last week. We use a dissipation influence. And the way this works is it takes whatever property you put into it here, voxel fog density in this case, and it starts removing it until it gets down to the background value at that rate. Pretty simple, really. I want it to dissipate quite quickly, so I'm going to set my rate to 2. Voxel fog density is fine, and background value is 0. So it's going to just take our density away. Just spotted something I missed. I did. Our speed needs to be plugged into that one. Good. Glad I did that. Let's have a look and see if that changes much. Does a bit. Fabulous. Now, you know, how detailed or non-detailed, how pretty or non-pretty you make this is completely up to you. I'm just doing a really quick explosion so we can get it into the Unreal Engine. But let's get our dissipation influence in. Goes in there with the Einstein, like so. And if we play that back now, you should start to see this fade away pretty quickly. You can see that this is all starting to fade out now. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and pause the video, and I'm going to put a memory cache on this so that I can play it through once and just cache it. And I'll come back when we've got something that's a bit faster. So here's the cache I've made, and it's shown me that there's a couple of things that aren't quite right. What we need this to do is we need this explosion to completely disappear by frame 64. And the reason we're doing that is so that we can turn this into a flipbook for Unreal and we can play it as a sprite. That's method one that we're going to go into later on in the lesson. So what's happening here is that it's looking pretty good. I'm happy with the way it looks and all of that kind of thing, but it's just not disappearing fast enough. It's also burning for far too long. So we need to make a couple of quick adjustments to that, and then we can go on. We're going to be advecting some particles with it, even though we won't be taking those into the engine. I just wanted to show you how we can do that because it's a cool thing. But we do need to get this to just completely disappear by frame 64, and it's not right now. So I haven't got it hooked up right now. I've just got the file cache hooked up. One thing I can do is drop the temperature. So instead of 700, we come down to something like 660. So not as much as burning for as long. That's one thing. And then we can take our dissipation influence and push that up to 3. So the rate is now dissipating a lot faster. So I will go away and cache that. So that's almost got it. We're almost at nothing. In fact, we're so close to nothing that I can fade that out inside Unreal, should I need to. But again, if we wanted to fix it for the cache, we would change the dissipation influence. We could also put in another one, like so, except this time we'll be working on the voxel temperature. And we'll be having that. Now this one, you don't want this influence to be working all the time. For this one, you just want this influence to work after a certain number of frames. So what I'm going to do is take the frame out, down a greater than, we have 64 frames. I'm going to say greater than 30. And take this influence down to 2. And I'm just going to put that into the enable. So when the frame is below 30, this influence won't be enabled at all. It won't be there. Nothing will happen. As soon as we get to frame 31, that influence is going to start to work and start lowering the temperature of our flame. So let's hook the file cache back up and try that again. I will pause and be back real shortly. Okay, and we're back. And this is what we've ended up with. So this is just basically a very simple, almost cartoony explosion that we will be using later on to get into Unreal. Now you can just follow the volcano tutorial on the PowerPoint as well. That will work just as well. And what we're going to do now is take the volume that we've created, whether it's via this or via the volcano or via whatever you like, and we're going to use it to do some cool things to particles. All right, so we'll just let that finish. You can see it's fading away pretty quickly now, which is good. And by the time it gets to the end, it's so faint that you won't really notice the pop. And as I said before, you can adjust the densities in Unreal as you go as well. And so there we are. So let's move on to doing things with particles.